The worldwide economic growth has drastically reversed in 2020. This effect, in large part, is found to be directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The global downturn reported is described as the worst such shift in a century. Many sectors within the economy will experience negative effects resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. Examples of these shifts include a reduction in market size, an accumulation of debt, a crisis in the housing sector, decrease in employment, in addition to many other shifts. Working from home is reshaping how consumers are spending their money locally. Many businesses have highlighted decreases in the percentage of customer spending, such as in retail, home furnishing, clothing stores, and gas stations. Solutions to overcome the economic downturn must be multidisciplinary and innovative in nature. Essentially, seeing changes in spending and retail patterns, converting more science into effective business, ideas towards reshaping local and global markets, and many more.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Garibe, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. I hope everyone is healthy and safe at this time, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us in the second COVID Special Panel Discussion Forum, a communication initiative in partnership with Natural Sciences and Engineering Council of Canada, with the goal of navigating the waves of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some housekeeping notes to help navigate the webinar. The panel discussion is set up in two sections. First one, each panelist will introduce their expertise with regards to our topic. The second section will open the floor for a Q&A discussion where the panelists are invited to answer your questions. Please keep your microphones and camera off during the presentation. If you have issues connecting to audio, you can call in by phone. Please refer to the email sent after your registration for phone numbers and meeting ID and password. For all your questions, please use the Q&A function button on the platform, and we will direct all the questions to our panelists during the open discussion of the webinar. This webinar will be made available on the COVID Spectrum YouTube channel soon after recording. Check our website and Twitter account for the video release. Today, we have the pleasure of presenting our second discussion topic webinar, tackling the effects of COVID-19 on the economy. And to help us navigate this topic, we have a panel of experts here. Let's introduce them briefly. And for this, I'll give the virtual podium to my partner and co-founder of COVID Spectrum, Dr. Al-Khalab.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you all for joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our panelists for the Economy webinar. I would like to welcome Mrs. Emmanuel Mansar, Mr. Stacy Nunes, Dr. Hanan Anis, and Mr. Nabil Ayoun. To give a brief introduction for each of our panelists, I'll start with our first guest today, Mrs. Emmanuel Mansar. Mrs. Mansar is an economist and the country risk analyst responsible for Western Europe and the North African region with the Economic Political Intelligence Center at Export Development Canada. Mrs. Mansar provides analysis on global economic issues and international business opportunities. She has experience in forecasting and analyzing a broad array of economic and political indicators. Let's get started. Our opening question directed to you, Mrs. Mansar. How do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the economy, specifically looking at it through your scope of expertise? Mrs. Mansar, please take the virtual podium.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today with you and participate in this discussion, especially alongside these other great panelists. So as you mentioned in your introduction, I work for Export Development Canada, so EDC. And just in case you, like for people in the audience that wouldn't be necessarily familiar with the institution, we are Canada's export credit agency. So we serve Canadian companies that are doing business internationally. So we offer financial products, insurance products, and knowledge products to support Canadian businesses. And within our economic department, we work on over 200 markets, and we try to navigate the sea of information and data that is available out here and try to link them together to support Canadian businesses. So in the current context, it's probably even more important. Needless to say that the COVID-19 pandemic is creating unprecedented and interesting times for all economists and, well, for all of us. And it has and it is affecting the economy in many different ways. And we can look at it actually through many different lenses. But maybe I would like to highlight three main points with you today. The first point is that it's really a global phenomenon where very few countries have been spared. So it has basically affected almost all economy around the world. So in phase one, we saw a swift rise in cases in China, and then it spread to Western Europe and specifically Italy and Spain. And it led to severe travel restrictions that have and will have significant effect on the global economy. In phase three, it's the US that took the center stage, and phase four is kind of what we're seeing right now, the fast escalation of cases in major emerging markets such as Brazil, Russia, and India. So that's really the first time that we've seen all the economies being very synchronized, being in lockdown at the same time, having restriction at the same time, and basically entering a recession more or less at the same time. So it's really a global and unprecedented phenomenon, and it's putting many countries at stress. So this leads actually to my second point, which is really that unprecedented times require unprecedented measures. So the speed at which this pandemic spread around the world surprised everybody, including the policymakers, and we had concern of overburdening our health system, which quickly led to self-isolation, social distances, and some cases strong lockdowns, like in Europe. And government and central banks around the world responded swiftly, and they liberated unprecedented amount of stimulus to their respective economies. So central banks cut their interest rate and they launched various asset purchase programs. Government also announced various packages of direct support and liquidity measures for households and businesses. And basically, it's kind of unprecedented in terms of policy response. It has been much stronger and much faster than during the global financial crisis. And so, for example, the central bank's asset purchases that are more or less double the scale of what was done during the global financial crisis. And my last point is about the different ways this pandemic is playing on the economy. So we talk about a bit the fact that all countries are impacted, but also within the economy, we have different impacts on different sectors. So we know that all countries and all sectors will be impacted or are impacted at the moment, but the way sector will recover could be a bit different. So if we look at Canada, for example, if we just look at some data on consumption spending for the first part of the year, we see that all the staples such as food, home-related entertainment goods, such as electronic TVs, office supplies have been some of the winning sectors in Canada. Well, mainly it's due to the change in lifestyle, so the work from home, social distancing directives. It has already changed our way of consuming. And other things like that can be a bit delayed, like cars, clothes, have performed less well, and all the spending that we could call maybe social interaction have experienced large drops. So culture, travel, restaurants, we don't go to restaurants anymore, airplane tickets, these are the sectors that have been strongly negatively impacted, so especially the service sector. So basically, just to summarize a bit, so the COVID-19 pandemic is really a global phenomenon that has affected almost all economies around the world. And in these unprecedented times, unprecedented measures are also necessary. And this pandemic will have different impacts depending on countries, but also within the countries depending on the sector of the economy. So I will stop there for now, but I'm happy to answer any questions later on any of these topics.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Mansar. Our next panelist is Mr. Stacy News. Mr. News is a business development officer and client relationship leader for the National Research Council of Canada, NRC. Mr. News has experience in research and development, focusing on collaborations with industry, and has been involved in the commercialization and transfer of R&D technology from government laboratories. Mr. News, our opening question, please tell us, how do you think COVID-19 pandemic has affected the economy, specifically looking at it through your government science to business viewpoint? The virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you, Laura, as well. Yeah, so during normal times, I just want to add is when I'm a business development officer. Currently, I'm on parental leave and will be off until October. So I've been watching from the sidelines for the last 3 or 4 months. I have to say, I am very proud to be part of the biotech ecosystem. I've seen a lot of companies and a lot of people step up. We're 3 years removed from being shut out of the supercluster sweepstakes. When they were being handed out. And in spite of that, I see a lot of really good companies being able to pivot into this space to try to help. Based on what their platforms are. I can think of Abcelera with their antibody platform, Immunovaccine with its adjuvant platform, Pillai and licensed COVID-19 therapeutic, and BBI. So very, very proud of the ecosystem, and I think they're going to continue to be a part of this. Unfortunately, how is this going to affect the economy from my perspective, looking at small startups in the biotech space? It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. The expectation is that capital is going to dry up in the near term. And so because of that, venture caps with the limited capital that they have are probably going to spend their money retrenching, right? And so reinvesting in companies they've already invested in. So companies that are looking for new money, it's going to be a little difficult. Government stimulus was put out there for, in terms of the wage subsidy. That's not really going to be a factor for most small startups that don't have revenue, right? They're pre-revenue, and so they wouldn't necessarily qualify. IRAP had the $250 million innovation assistance program, but I'm hearing now that they say 97% of it has already been placed, so from NRC, I can say that we are working with a number of small companies and on COVID activities, but also in other areas. We have a couple of challenge programs, one that was instituted to support companies that are developing technologies that can help with COVID, and that's called the Pandemic Response Challenge Program. We also have an ongoing challenge program on cell and gene therapy, so that is there. The benefit of that is that we can actually provide some funding, and we will provide our expertise without repayment. So that can help. But I think, again, it's a lot of this is not going to take away from a lot of the difficulties that some of the small startups are going to have over the next 6 months, not to mention reduced staffing, reduced lab presence, and they still have the same milestones that they're trying to meet. I think in the long term, we're good, right? I think the biotech industry was in a very strong position pre-pandemic. I think this pandemic has only helped to heighten the value of what biotech brings. So I think that is going to help if we can get through this little short patch. I think there's a lot of investment going into the biotech space from government in order to help enable, COVID response. But those same investments will also help facilitate other innovative technologies in the biotech space. And, I look at biomanufacturing as being one that we're looking at trying to boost. And yeah, so I think that, and then of course, there's an understanding now that health is an underlying need in all aspects. So, when you look at COVID-19, yes, it's had an impact on a lot of people, elderly especially, but comorbidities have been a big factor. And now I think there's a realization from government, but also from the general public, that we can't let things like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease just kind of sit and, we're going to have to try to address those. So I think that those opportunities are going to be there. I just want to leave you with one other thought. Absolutely, as Manuel says, this is unprecedented times. The only corollary I can think of is going back to 9/11. Even though it was just mainly a US situation. And so with 9/11, we had a bit of a financial collapse that, Alan Greenspan was able to kind of money market us out of. And there was obviously a need to address terrorism, but I don't know if everybody remembers, there was also a biological component to it, a bioterrorism component to it because of the anthrax scare, as people were being mailed anthrax maybe 2 or 3 weeks after 9/11. That led to the US creating an organization that eventually became another organization that eventually became BARDA, okay, in 2006. And BARDA has been a big centerpiece in the US biotech ecosystem, funding early stage technologies that address what their needs were. And initially their needs were bioterrorism related, but then it expanded to talk about natural threats and emerging threats. So I just want to, if you don't mind, I'm going to read this so I don't get it wrong. BARDA's mission statement, which I pulled off of the web. BARDA's mission is to develop and procure needed medical countermeasures, including vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and non-pharmaceutical countermeasures against a broad array of public health threats, whether natural or intentional in origin. BARDA was created to address gaps in the US government medical countermeasure development and procurement process, and to bridge the valley of death that separates candidates identified in early research from potential FDA licensure approval by providing funding, technical support, and services necessary to advance candidate products. I guess my comment is, I think that's where we are in Canada today. Okay, so the US created BARDA when 9/11 happened, and they realized that they were going to be facing threats that they did not have responses to because the natural market system wasn't going to address those. I think Canada realizes now that it might be in the same position. We are going to get the 300 million plus one dose of a vaccine from Moderna, J&J, AstraZeneca, or anybody else, because the US government has already, basically procured the first 300 million doses. So we'll get the next one if we're lucky. And I think there's a realization that we need to do something about that. So I think that that is going to provide the biotech community here in Canada with an opportunity. I'm hopeful. I have no insight because I've been on the sidelines, but that would be something I'd want to leave you with. And I'll close there.
Thank you so much, Stacy, for that. And now we will move on to our third panelist for today, Dr. Hanan Anis. Dr. Anis is a professor in electrical and computer engineering at the University of Ottawa. She holds an NSERC chair in entrepreneurial engineering design and is the coordinator of entrepreneurship and innovation. Dr. Anis' current research interests include biophotonics, innovation, and engineering education. Dr. Anis is passionate about helping students graduate with an entrepreneurial mindset that enables them to play leading roles in existing organizations or to create their own jobs. Dr. Anis, would you please tell us how you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the economy, looking at it from your set of expertise and experience? The virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Mo, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. I certainly, given that I'm the third person to speak, I will build on the stuff that both Emmanuel and Stacy have pointed to. And rather than state the obvious again about that actually it's a global pandemic and a global recession, I want to sort of point to the fact that different sectors of society or industries are going to be affected very differently. And people are speaking about the V-shaped recovery, the U-shaped recovery, and the L-shaped recovery. And certain things we can see as obvious, for example, cruises are going to be in the L-shaped recovery because as people who would be consumers, nobody wants to step foot on a cruise anytime soon. So you could see that. While others, I want to, though, focus my attention on areas where there's probably growth that is going to happen. And I want to point to a couple of them. So in the past, not long ago, since the shutdown in mid-March, 5 million Canadians have been working from home. This is 40% of the workforce. It's typically the educated, finance people, IT people, management, and many of us are realizing that there is an opportunity. We actually don't need to go to the office every single day like we have been doing. With that comes a lot of opportunities from an entrepreneurial point of view. From the regular communication sector to even productivity, to the Zoom platform that we're sitting on, there's tons and tons of opportunities there. Number two is how we shop. Many of us have shopped things that we have never shopped online. And even post COVID-19, I expect many of us realize that, geez, we can shop online for many things and we don't actually need to waste time, go to the stores. And the implications of that is like e-commerce platform are up. There is even, a push for local suppliers. Many of us are trying to shop locally. So this is, again, an opportunity. How we watch things, arts, entertainment, moving from going to places to watching online. There are lots of places that have online, from the British Museum to orchestras watching online. So again, as a society, we really have to wrestle with how are we going to consume entertainment after COVID-19. My sector, which is post-secondary education, I believe there's going to be a big shift and a big move to what we call lifelong learning. Is a concept that we have been talking about for many years, but lifelong learning, people joke that it was a an empty notion, but I'm sure that it's not going to continue to be an empty notion. Lifelong learning is going to increase in a major way. And even on the medical sector, there are lots of things that you could imagine doing it differently, and might end up with a lot of positiveness for people over the long run. So I just wanted to point that there are opportunities with this misery that we're living in. There are lots of opportunities, and we should think of those opportunities. The other thing that I want to, so hopefully I gave you the positive this way, but I also want to point out to something that is important, is that COVID-19 didn't hit us all the same. It hit significantly the poor more, the less educated the more, the new immigrants more. Racially, it was not equal. And this is something as a society we need to contend with and understand and think through. And it's something that I really would like people to take away. I don't have an answer to this, but it's something that I really, really like as a society to think through. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hanan, for that. Finally, our last panelist for today is Mr. Nabil Ayoun. Mr. Ayoun is a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada within the International Energy Branch. He has a multidisciplinary background spanning from economics to international business and engineering. Mr. Ayoun is part of a community of practice with Polytechnique Montréal, applying system dynamics to solving problems arising in complex economic, social, and environmental systems. Mr. Ayoun, looking at the COVID-19 pandemic through your scope, how do you think pandemics affect the economy? The virtual podium is yours. You're still on mute. I'm sorry, Nabil, you're still on mute.
Are you hearing me now?
There we go.
Thanks for the introduction. I was saying, and so as an economist, it's typically hard to stray from the disciplines pillar, and I'm sure Emmanuel will agree with me. But to complement the fellow panelists and all the introduction that they've said on the topic, I'm going to speak from an engineering perspective. So without any delay, I'll ask the question in the other way around, how the economy is coping with COVID. So one way of answering the question is to use what we call the systemic approach. That's a scientific perspective to understanding change, basically. So in order to understand how the COVID impacted our economies, we need to understand the economic dynamics. Okay, so the unprecedented nature of this crisis has brought unprecedented measures. We talked about it, shutdown policies, lockdown policies that have affected the whole economy and created a new form of recession, basically, that's called now pandemic recession, which is completely different than any other crisis that we've experienced in the past. One of the key issues of fighting the pandemic is therefore the huge health impact that it had on human beings. The health consequences have a cost. It's called the economic cost. And because of the coronavirus has huge economic consequences, one way to answering the big question is that we understand the scope of the impact on the economy and the dynamics that this virus has caused. So from an engineering perspective, one way of doing it is to think systems and the study of dynamics and be able to discern the complexity behind the pandemic. Basically, we look at what we call the feedback structure between the systems, and that causes the changes. And we observe all that we actually observe all around us nowadays, in every sphere of the society, of the economy. And we all agree that the context of COVID we are living in has drastically changed this different subsystems, and I'll get to this in a couple of seconds, of the economy. We saw drastic drops of greenhouse gas emissions, drastic fall of GDP, drastic drop of oil prices, of human activity in general. So let's talk about the economy as a great system and the big picture, basically, and it's comprised of different subsystems, and we name financial systems, the banking industry, social systems, populations, people, you and I, business systems, so the private sector, the firms, governmental systems, infrastructure systems, such as hospitals, roads, airports, energy systems. We have environmental systems as well, such as air, earth, and biodiversity, the animal world. So just to name a few, and these subsystems of the economy are interrelated one to another through what we call the causal loops, creating, therefore, the dynamic state of the economy. And in physics, there are basically two states of the environment, the static and the dynamic. So the static has properties of linearity, whereas the dynamic state has non-linear properties. And if you recall your Calculus 101 courses, solving a linear equation is much simpler than solving a non-linear equation, which makes the complexity even higher to assess the overall impact of COVID on the economy. So instead of just taking it from a focal single standpoint as an independent system. So if we talk about the social subsystem, for instance, we saw how the social distancing measures and the lockdown policies have directly impacted the subsystem of businesses. And the business subsystems has impacted, in turn, the financial system. And that has impacted the governmental system, pushing them to subsidize massively the economy. Another example of infrastructure systems is how the social distancing measures have impacted directly the healthcare systems, where we saw, such as people, the way they behave with respect to the lockdown policies by the governmental system. So everything is interconnected. So the complexity is there, and there are three main keywords here: is complexity, systems, and the dynamics. If we talk about energy, one of my field of specialty, we clearly see that there is an impact on the energy systems that is in turn impacted the business system through a historical reduction of oil prices due to weak commodity prices as well. From the clean tech perspective, no longer than yesterday, the International Energy Agency has reported that the COVID is having a major impact on energy systems around the world, curbing investments and threatening to slow down the expansion of a clean tech technology. So we clearly see that everything is interconnected, and the complexity is going to grow more and more, unfortunately, and we need more than ever a multidisciplinary approach to understanding. And this is the joy of looking at the world and the economy from the systems thinking perspective.
Thank you so much, Nabil, for that. Thank you all to our panelists. This concludes the first section of our panel forum. Now, in the second section, we will ask our panelists to answer questions sent to us from the audience via the Q&A function box. Just a reminder, you can send us your questions directly, and we will try to answer as many as possible within our allotted time. I will give the podium now to my partner, Lara, for the first question.
Thank you. And thank you to our expert panel for this engaging discussion so far. Proceeding with the first question, I will start with Mrs. Mansar. What are the long-term impacts of COVID-19 on unemployment, underemployment, and the global economic outlook?
Thank you very much for this question. So I would actually, yeah, that's a really good question that we could decompose into two different things. So first, more about employment and unemployment. So like as we saw in the numbers, so there has been a lot of temporary lays off. Let's hope that they stay temporary. And so then the question becomes, what do we do after? So government put a lot of policies in place to help support companies through this environment to allow temporary layoff. But then the question becomes, are we able to rehire everyone? As Dr. Anis mentioned, there are 40% of the population that can work from home. Will these people continue to work from home? Will it change the way employment is seen, like for policymakers, for businesses? That's kind of the long-term question about employment in general. In the short term, we actually, of course, hope that this temporary layoff will remain temporary, and then that people will be hired again and be able to come back to the workforce relatively quickly, relatively smoothly. Then the question is also about the people that are entering the workforce right now. If we think about students were supposed probably to have internship in the summer, or some people were graduating and beginning a new job. So it's been postponed, sometimes it's been canceled. So the long-term impact of these people entering the workforce right now, it's of course still unknown, but they will have consequences on unemployment for sure. Regarding the second part of your question, that is more about the global economic outlook. So there is a difference, of course, between the short term and the long term, but on the short term, as I think it's Mr. Nunes who mentioned that it will get better. At EDC, we are kind in a perpetual forecasting mode, like probably many other forecasters, to try to understand what's gonna happen next. But globally, we expect an economic recovery probably starting in the second part of the year, mainly because the restriction will be lifted, and then things will slowly, I don't want to say get back to normal, because then we can enter into philosophical question, or will everything be normal again? But things will begin to recover. There will be some pent-up demand, and consumption will restart. Investment will eventually restart as well. So we'll see economic recovery starting in the second part of the year, and then going into 2020. The path of the recovery will depend on countries, will depend on the end of the lockdown and the end of the restriction, the end of the containment measures that have been put in place. But yes, we expect some economic recovery. On the long term, it will likely change the way we do things. I guess we're gonna probably discuss that more over the rest of the discussion. But again, as Dr. Anis mentioned, it's gonna be a good opportunity to rethink the way we are doing things.
Thank you, Mrs. Mansar. And I will reformulate the question a bit and ask it to Dr. Anis. So from your perspective, what do you think? You have mentioned a bit the impact on unemployment and underemployment, but what do you think are the long-term impacts on the general professional career advancement?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, my feeling is that well, things are in turmoil right now, for sure, and long-term implication is not crystal clear. But one thing that is clear is that there are, despite all this misery, there are opportunities, and I think opportunities. And as a university professor, I think there is opportunities for retraining and reskilling of people. So, the way I see it is people need to be flexible and really look at the opportunities that present to them. And when the telecom collapsed in the 2003, 2004 era, people reskilled. And I think a similar situation will happen. We already see, as an obvious example, like Zoom, because of this misery, suddenly everybody is using Zoom. And I see that there are other opportunities going to present in every sector. And I think from an entrepreneurial point of view, despite the difficulties of the money, despite the unemployment, the people that actually can find that niche and find those opportunities will have a longer term benefit. So does that answer your question, Lara?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that. So I'll ask the next question and I'll direct it to Mr. Nunes. Can you elaborate a little bit more for those who don't know exactly what are the IRAP and Insert Government Challenge programs to start you off? You're on mute.
Sorry.
There you go.
These are NRC challenge programs, National Research Council challenge programs. They were established because there were some key areas that government had identified where NRC had skills and capabilities to address or help companies address a problem, but a lot of the companies in the space didn't necessarily have funds to pay for research and development work that would need to be done. Because normally at NRC, we can do work for companies and we get paid for the research and development. So some challenge programs were established. The first one was in cell and gene therapy. So these are any type of therapies that utilize, either cellular or gene manipulation. And in those, there's a call for proposals, and companies can apply towards the call for specific things that are required. And if they're approved, then there's actually funding that goes from NRC to the company to help support the work that the company defines. But beyond that, there's also skills that NRC has, capabilities, expertise, biomanufacturing, assay development, that we can dedicate our personnel to doing. And this would be in full collaboration. And again, it helps to facilitate companies being able to get work done without having to expend a lot of money. So that's the challenge program. So there's one on cell and gene therapy, and now there's one on pandemic response. And so those are the two programs there. The IRAP program I referred to is Innovation Assistance Program, and that you apply to through your IRAP ITA, and that will help get you some funding to try to tie you through the shutdown that's currently going on. Oh.
I think today the mute unmute button has not been my friend. I will ask you a follow up, Stacy, if you don't mind. So, looking at it for a little bit of in a bigger lens here, how can government agencies focusing on research and development contribute to the economic success in science, working within the limitations put on by the COVID-19 pandemic response, specifically addressing the fact that government has put so much money into mitigating early lockdown effects?
Right. So when you talk about government research and development organizations, I mean, so again, NRC being one, there are other departments that also have research expertise. Really what we strive to do is to develop platform capabilities that a number of companies are going to require. Like I said, biomanufacturing is one. In the biologics development space, antibody development is one. So things that many companies are going to require. so that the government can develop the capability and expertise in that, so that each individual startup company doesn't have to reinvent this, doesn't have to do this for themselves. There's a central resource that they can go to for that. And I think that, again, in the biotech space, realizing that there's an urgent need to be able to tackle some of these situations very quickly, the central role of a government R&D organization with tentacles and fingers into industry to try to make sure that they can, build on what other companies have already developed. I think that is a way in which government can help, right? A central role for government to help. Yeah. And this is beyond funding. Funding is always something that's welcome, for sure.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. My next question is directed to Mr. Ayoun. So, in a recent commentary, it was mentioned that a reason for the current market failure is an inherent misalignment between economic incentives driving industry versus benefits to public health. My question here is there a chance to create a new economy that has better alignments between financial gain and public good?
Excellent question, addressed to the excellent panelists. So I think we're experiencing clearly a new economic paradigm that's called the COVID economics, basically. So there's an urgent need to adopt and embrace a new approach of addressing this crisis and try to attempt saving the economy, if you can say so. And this pandemic is a great opportunity for us to advance the way we look at global issues. One of the reasons is that traditional mainstream economics theories, by trying to become a science, has failed to answer major questions about real-life economic behavior. And we are experiencing it on a day-to-day living today. In other words, the ways our economy perform, especially in the context of global crisis, I'm calling the so-called Gob-Douglas production function the input-output model. Those are traditional models, and we need to embrace new models in order to answer the question. And because the COVID has huge economic consequence, it makes sense to explore new avenues and innovate in the way we see the world around us. And innovation is not, by the way, a matter of innovating a product or a service, but also a matter of thinking and seeing, our economies and our future. And the idea is to provide not just solutions, but sustainable solutions. And I think that we can realize this through, gathering a different area of disciplines and trades, such as epidemiologists, policymakers, business decision makers, and even individuals like us all, to assess the propensity of the economic damage of COVID. So yes, there is room for expansion. There is room for new renewal. And as Emmanuel mentioned, we talk a lot about getting back to normal, which I'm not really comfortable with, because I think what will happen now is getting back to a new normal. I would think about the fact that some issues and the way we used to do in the past, whether regardless of the economic context, crisis or not a crisis, things that used to be at a smaller scale will become now at a larger scale. And I think of e-commerce. We all started buying our grocery online. It existed in the past, but at a smaller scale. And I think we're going to see much more share of the economy that's going to be online. Another thing is that we want to spend our money. Everybody is eager to spend our money in restaurants, in still going out, enjoying life in general. And we have to find sustainable solutions, and not just for us today, but also for future generations. So I would say that there's always a way of doing innovation and embrace change. So basically, it's about not resisting to this change, and we can go forward. On the one last word to conclude, I would say that what happens if tomorrow we have a second wave? Are we going to go back to the lockdown strategies again? What happens in 2, 3, 5 years? We receive a new pandemic. Are we embracing the same traditional models? No, we need to innovate. We need to face things differently. And as I explained, the theory of complex systems, the systemic approach, and I invite the audience to just Google what is a system thinking that can be used in everyday life. Everything is interconnected.
Thank you, Mr. Ayoun. Yes, Mr. Nunes, you wanted to add something to this?
Yeah, so, and I'll also go back to my example of BARDA, right? But like the typical MBA example of what government is supposed to do is, the bridge or the dam that is going to benefit everybody, right? But no one person wants to build it, right? Because market forces aren't going to drive a single company to build that bridge unless they're able to charge a lot to cross it, and then you end up with other economic issues. So government is supposed to step in, build the bridge. I look at this pandemic, and because of this disease, the government is going to have to spend somewhere between $250 and $500 billion, right, to get us out of it. It would have been in our collective benefit if we had tools in our toolbox already to try to deal with some of these types of issues. But market forces were not going to incentivize any one company to do it in the absence of a pandemic, right? Like no one saw coronavirus, COVID-19 coming. And that is why the US established BARDA, right? That is why the US said we are going to fund early stage innovation so that if we do end up with a bioterrorist attack of, anthrax or whatever, we are going to have tools in our toolbox to help address it. And I think now we realize that, this is the third pandemic in 20 years, right? The third major one. If you look at SARS and you look at MERS, H1N1, H5N1, I mean, again, so maybe there's more than that. I think at some point in time, government is going to have to step in and help to fund the development of innovation and technologies that will address future pandemics. And I think that each country is going to have to do it themselves, because right now every country's in it for themselves. The US is sponsoring research, but they're getting the first 300 million doses. That's going to be tough for us. Anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you, Stacey. I'll ask the next question here, and I'll direct it to Mrs. Mansar. So we're hearing about a lot of stimulus measures from both fiscal and monetary side to help Canadian SMEs. Other than these traditional routes, what could be some non-traditional measures that some group like EDC or OGD can take or are taking to help Canadian SMEs?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. Indeed, we hear a lot about different programs that the government put in place, including EDC and BDC, so Business Development Bank of Canada, for example, working hand in hand to help support Canadian companies. So yes, that's true. We hear a lot about the financing ones, but I think what this type of institution can also do is provide a lot of knowledge advice as well, like knowledge on how your sector is doing, or are you like doing compared to your peers? What are the different maybe innovation you can put in place to develop your company and to survive also in this time of crisis? So like finding new processes, new ways of developing your business, innovative way, like trying to go online eventually, or diversify your distribution channel, the way you reach your customers. That's all of these questions that probably company ask themselves and would like help on that. So it's not necessarily EDC per se that will be the only one to help you with that, but EDC offers a lot of knowledge product, sector papers, webinars on how to reach your customers. Before it was focused mainly on helping Canadian going abroad, but now it's diversifying a bit to help Canadian companies, of course, even those that are not going abroad, in partnership with BDC. So I think reaching out to this institution just through the regular line with your questions, and then this institution can provide a lot of knowledge advice that can be quite useful to help you kind of navigate this crisis.
Thank you, Mrs. Mansah. And the last question from our attendees is directed for Dr. Anis. So not all nations and within nations, not all sectors are prepared to face new paradigms, like doing more e-commerce or e-training or even teleworking. Just imagine all countries with huge informal sectors. So the question is this creating new inequalities?
So that's a great question. And let me start by Canada, since this is where we all live. I think already, and I touched that about that, COVID-19 has shown us that there is a lot of inequality that exists in society. Whether we like it or not, it tends to target people specifically that who are vulnerable in many ways. We have seen it in long-term facilities, how it hit people. We see it in North Montreal as opposed to the rest of Montreal, where there is a huge population of new immigrants and Black. We have seen it. So the inequalities are there. And I think today, in my opinion, as we are wrestling with the new norms, we have to keep that in our work. Like, we have to think it through. We have to put policies to ensure that this does not happen, because it's happening. The fact that we are not talking about it as much doesn't mean it's not happening. It is happening, and we need to ensure that in our policies, in our training, maybe it's an opportunity for the government to retrain. There are sectors that we know, for example, are going to be more bigger. How do we ensure that these sectors are properly funded and people are properly trained to make sure that that doesn't exist? Now, if I move from Canada, I think within a Canadian system, we can do that. You know, as COVID is going on, there are lots of, talk about racism. There's lots of marshes. There's lots of people who are saying inequalities are huge. So maybe it's an opportunity for us to look at those inequalities and do something about it. In terms of other countries, yeah, absolutely. Inequalities are going to get larger. And, I don't know what we can do about that. But yeah, we see it. We experience it every day, the haves and the have-nots. And in other countries, it exists. And unfortunately, it is getting larger. But I believe at least that within a Canadian system, we can do something about it if we focus on it.
Thank you so much for that. As we bring our economy webinar to a close, on behalf of the COVID Spectrum team, I would like to thank our audience for their participation and hope that this webinar session has given you a much clearer understanding of the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. I would also like to thank all our panelists for accepting our invitation. Your expert opinion is much needed during these times. We have one last question that we will ask, and we'll invite each of our panelists to answer one by one. The question is, what is the one thing you want the audience to do or to know coming out of the discussion on the effects of COVID-19 on the economy? And I will start with the last person to speak, Dr. Anis, please.
Thank you, Mo. My message is, let's not return back to normal. Let's return to a better normal, to a much more positive, equal, and better Canada. It might take longer, but let's not go super fast to reach the old norm, because obviously this pandemic showed us that our old norm didn't quite work for us. So it is an opportunity for us to rethink things, from inequality to training to new sectors in the economy. And let's use this opportunity to get there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I will direct the question now to Mr. Nabil Ayoun. What is the one thing you want the audience to do or to know coming out of this discussion on the effects of COVID-19 on the economy?
So quickly, I'll say that every decision everyone makes will impact the environment, whether it's your family, your friends, your company, your business. Everything is impacted by what you do. And what's positive, and to end on a positive note, human beings have one excellent skill. It's called the adaptive skill. We will adapt to the situation. We need to embrace change and move forward and make the best of our knowledge to make this world and this economy as resilient as possible, regardless of the future, whether it's another pandemic or a second wave.
Thank you so much, Nabil. I will direct now the question to Stacy. What is the one thing you want the audience to do or to know coming out of this discussion on the effects of COVID-19 on the economy?
Thank you, Mo. Well, again, I'm always going to look at things through my lens of healthcare innovation. And I think that what this pandemic has demonstrated is the importance of healthcare innovation. And in a country like Canada, where we do view healthcare and health as a right, we need to really take a good hard look at the amount of investment money we're putting into this space versus some of the other spaces. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And I will now ask the question to Emmanuel. What is the one thing you want the audience to do or to know coming out of this discussion on the effects of COVID-19 on the economy?
Yeah, so first, thanks again for having us with you today. That was a really interesting discussion, and I think we could have told really so much more on so many other topics. As Mr. Ayoun mentioned, like so many things are interrelated that it's hard to draw just one conclusion. But I would really like the audience to remember that it's really historic bad shock that has really complex impacts on, again, many lenses of the economy. And compared to previous crises, it's really broad-based. And what we're seeing in terms of growth number, or what we're actually like lack of growth that we are seeing, it's pretty significant and it's pretty weak. Again, it's the first time that all countries are really synchronized and are in recession at the same time. The negative impact are big on many countries, but also on a country level. And there is a vast majority of households and companies that are negatively affected. Sectors also are all impacted. We discussed that, affected in different ways. But unlike typical other downturn, here it's really the service sectors that is hit harder. And there are multiple scenarios going forward that could potentially play out, because again, it's not a scenario that we've seen many times, a pandemic of this size and this impact. So really a lot will depend on the containment measures and their success, the duration of these measures, and the way it will impact consumer and business sentiment, and the way, and so therefore also kind of the recovery and the policy measures, but also their exit strategy and the way we remove some of these measures that have been put in place. So a lot of questions will come to that to tackle this and to make sure that we do things probably a bit differently, not wanting to repeat what other people say, but this pandemic is once in a lifetime, once in a career shock. Well, at least I hope it's once in a lifetime shock. So that's also why it's hard to determine the full impact of this crisis. But and there is a lot of questions still without answer. But that's a really good time to start being creative, thinking about different ways of doing things, taking different approaches, and having the type of conversation we had today. It's already a good start. So thanks again for having us.
Thank you again to our panelists, and it was a pleasure having you here with us today. Finally, our next webinar will tackle the effects of COVID-19 on research. Stay tuned, and for more information, visit our website at www.covidspectrum.com. Follow us on Twitter at COVID Spectrum, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, COVID Spectrum. If you have any comments or feedback for us, we would love to hear back from you. For that, you can visit our website and go to the Contact Us tab to send your message. Until next time, stay safe wherever you are.
For more information and event details, visit our website at www.covidspectrum.com and follow us on social media.